Okay, welcome back. Let's continue our investigation of this very rich chapter. As you can see, there's plenty to explore in each section of this quite wonderful reading. So let's continue on. Let's have a look now at the section that's titled Pedagogy. And there are lots of great ideas here that I want to just explore and highlight for you. So let's go down to where the authors begin this section explaining what the term pedagogy means and this idea of what does it capture when we talk about pedagogy. And you'll hear this term throughout your course. If you haven't been introduced to it already, I'm sure you have, but if you haven't, it's a word that describes something more than when we say teaching or teaching and learning. Pedagogy is quite a scientific sounding word that describes the process of teaching and learning, and what teachers do to enact pedagogy is often talked about. So it's the decisions that are made around learning and how that happens in the particular environments that teachers create in a school. So let's look at here how the authors problematize, trouble, cast a critical eye over this notion of pedagogy. What does that actually mean, and what actually occurs in normal practice, the normal practice of pedagogy, and the power of that, and how certain things occur as a result of the practice of pedagogy in most schools. So they talk about how teachers are these active agents that deliberately sort of make decisions, choose the particular learning that is to occur in a classroom and ensure that that occurs, and thinking about how that actually works in the modern classroom, about this notion of social technologies embedded in school architecture. I mean, you could look at, and they do talk about later in the chapter around the architecture of the school, the classroom, the desks, etc. So it's this sentence here that I just want to highlight for you because it's quite important, where they describe it as the almost overwhelming power of this taken for granted view of teaching, being the teacher as the active agent and the student as somewhat passive. It depends on where you're looking, but as described earlier, the teacher is the one making those critical decisions. They're the ones that are equipped with the information, they understand the curriculum, they understand how to make learning happen safely and effectively in a classroom, that sort of notion of working with the group to ensure that lesson plan can progress. So the teacher is the active decision maker. Yes, the students are sometimes making decisions about their learning, or there's some element of decision making that the teacher has handed over to them, but it's this taken for granted view of teaching that it's very universal and it's very difficult to resist. And that is absolutely true. This notion that it's the teacher as active and the student as passive. And you'll probably want to go into your first learning experiences that you've designed for students, where students have got more of a role, an active role in the learning. And depending on the school, but very quickly you'll find that you'll take on more of the role and the students will take on less. And the students will simply do what you ask them to do. And they talk about this notion of what teachers are actually doing is very rarely talked about. So they say that teachers intend to create certain environments for students. They settle the class, they establish those conditions for learning, etc. Rather than the reality of if you were to sit in the back of the classroom and simply report on what is the teacher doing. Okay, the teacher stands in front of the class. The teacher instructs the students to be quiet through various settling methods. The teacher gains control and to a lesser or greater extent at various points in the 60-minute lesson, for example. And that's what the authors are quite correct in that the teacher is exerting control most of the time over students. And a lot of the instructions that teachers give are about maintaining that control, whether it be over behavior, whether it be over what is learned, the pace of the learning, how that's learned, what groups together in terms of the concept, that is directed by the teacher. They are the ones with the authority. So again, it's just kind of understanding what is going on. I'm not necessarily saying that that's a good or a bad thing all the time. Sometimes it's important. It does work in classrooms. It achieves certain aims. But again, it's this notion of troubling what is going on here. Why do we take for granted that this is practice as usual and this is how teachers assert themselves? This is the role of the teacher. So yeah, the authors talk about this notion of control here, activities, etc. And I like how they end this particular section here. While this may not be a nice or comforting way to talk about what teachers do, it does allow thought to be given to the ways pedagogical strategies are based on teacher control rather than on student learning. So it's the sense of when you start planning your first learning experiences, you go, well, is this about me being in control or is it about student learning? If it's about control, okay, at least I acknowledge that rather than just take it for granted or not think about that in any way. So the authors encourage you to say, well, maybe you can consider other ways of doing things. And it is very difficult as a new teacher, certainly, to break free of the practice as usual in a given school. Certainly when you have your first prac experiences, you are cast as somebody without skill or experience or knowledge. And all the experienced teachers are the ones that have it. So they transmit their knowledge to you and saying, well, this is what works here, and this is what you mirror. And in certainly your professional practice units, when you start to do those, it's strongly encouraged, even from the university sector and from your lecturers, your tutors, etc., that yes, you will mirror the kinds of strategies and behavior management programs and ways of dealing with students that you see being enacted in front of you. You mirror those, and then you start to build your own repertoire after that. So just by that mirroring process, you're already embedding a kind of taken for granted practice as usual approach, and then it's very difficult to break free after that. So the authors highlight for you the notion of power and talking about what power is and beginning to think about power in a different way to how you may normally think about it. So although they don't cite this particular philosopher, this notion of power comes from the work of Michel Foucault. So Foucault is a French philosopher, sociologist, historian. I'll put a note on the Facebook page and on the YouTube notes to his Wikipedia page if you want to read more about Foucault. If you've never come across him before, it's very dense. Takes a long time to get your head around Foucault's writing and the concepts he introduces in sociology, history, etc. But they give a very nice, succinct definition of power and what this means in pedagogy here and the exercise of power. And I'll just read it out to make it clear. Often power is thought about as simply repressive. So it's the notion that, for example, the government has power and they repress those who have no power. So it goes one way. It goes from those who have the top and those with no power at the bottom are repressed by those who hold power. So this has been the argument of the traditional left of socialism for a long time, this notion that the powerless are unable to have any active agency, and certainly marginalized groups, women, people of color, etc. There is a hegemony at play. People who hold the power, whether it be money, whether it be authority in the police force or government, etc., then repress. Now, there's not to say that that doesn't happen. Of course that happens. But thinking about power as simply repressive is not enough. It's too simple. Power is much more complicated than that. And that notion of, okay, well, we need to get rid of power, we need to make things equal, and that will solve all our problems. Again, that's too simple an answer. Thinking about power as the capacity, as productive, not just repressive, is critical here. So just this definition here where they give it, I just want to focus on the power is the capacity to shape situations, ideas, or actions. It can take the form of physical or material force, law, ideas, discourses, practices, or procedures. So power is productive. It shapes things. It shapes people. It shapes ideas. It shapes institutions. It is micro. It is relational. It is influential. So thinking about power as influence. So what is influencing what in a particular situation, in a particular institution or organization or relationship is a much more nuanced, is a much more complex way to understand power, and I think much more powerful if we are to look at education, we look at modern institutions of education, understand power as not just being repressive but also productive, gives us a much more a much richer view of what's going on, and I think can allow us to think about things in new ways in order to create new questions about what we see and start to work out potentially new answers to these questions, to big problems. As the authors again set out at the very beginning of this chapter, this idea that schooling is failing large sections of the population. A lot of students don't get a lot out of schooling. So how do we address that problem? Maybe, not just maybe, I think very much so, we need to have a new concept of power in education. And this chapter helps us understand that. So let's now whiz down. I just want to go through this history section is important to go through yourself, but I just want to come right down to some of where they talk about the recent developments and changes as well, and they refer to certain particular areas of education. So I just want to focus for a second on classroom management here, because this is one area that often pre-service teachers, when they're beginning their course, are concerned about. How do I manage the behavior of students? How do I manage classrooms? So thinking about how has classroom management theory or praxis developed, and I like this idea about how they do talk about the films about teaching and how schools work as sites of struggle for order, that the teacher is constantly struggling to maintain order, that they're a battleground, and that the teacher needs to remain firm and in control and strong and in authority, and if they relinquish that authority, if they show weakness, if they show fear, then the students will eat them alive, attack them, tear them down, climb the walls, etc., etc. So this statement here that current policy might say that it focuses on learning, but in practice, a kind of taken for granted knowledge insists that particularly new teachers quickly learn how to maintain order and control in the classroom. If you don't maintain order and control in the classroom, there is no way that a particular learning program can progress. It's, as I say, it is impossible to teach. So when we talk about classroom management, the focus is still primarily on discipline. That management means discipline. Okay, so that's still what occurs in the classroom right now, and in schools. And schools are grappling with the issue of student behavior and poor student behavior. And some schools are worse in terms of, I say worse, meaning some schools have more of an issue with this than others, depending on a number of factors, socioeconomic just being one. So let's just, again, whiz down here just to highlight a couple more issues here for you, particularly around technologies of schooling and this idea of social technologies. I'd just like to highlight for you because it's quite important, because again, it's not really thought of a lot of the time. about this idea of how spaces are organized, how relationships and procedures are organized in schooling, how they facilitate some things and make others difficult, and give individuals the capacity for action and control others, constrain relationships and behavior. So thinking about technology working in terms of socially. So how is a particular school organized along the lines in which the authors explore here? So let's just focus here. I think they give some very tangible, great examples here about, so one example, the buildings as a kind of social technology, meaning how does the space, the physical space, define what socially happens, whether that's between the students or between the teacher and the student. So they give an example here how when the schools were built en masse, when they created classrooms for larger and larger numbers of students, how there was a powerful social technology embedded here about it's the teacher in control, again reinforcing that argument, because they're the ones that have the authority over the equipment, over the space, the organization of desks, that they are the ones who are, they have their own desk or their own section of the classroom, their own key for the cupboard and the resources, etc. So they're the ones who are just making those important decisions. Who is in control here? Students have little control, the teacher has a large amount of control. And again, you might think, well, obviously that's important, otherwise no learning will happen. Really? Why do you take that for granted? So think about how that's been embedded over the history of schooling. Again, another little example, this notion of the school staff room, how that was created as an exclusive area for teachers, so it marked their difference, that teachers had a particular status in schools, they were allowed particular space in which they were free from having any students enter that space, and the school staff room is still quite a powerful space in a school. Obviously students understand that it has status, they will knock to enter, they will have to ask to enter that sacred space, and so on. But again, it puts the child as inferior and subordinate in that environment. So let's move down. They cite another very tangible examples about textbooks. Schools are now moving away somewhat from textbooks. I mean, they're moving more onto laptops and iPads, etc. But textbooks or texts, whether they be on an iPad or laptop or a physical text, still very much allow that central control over content. So they align themselves with, textbooks align with the curriculum. They give a tangible focus for student learning, tangible activities. Students will be busy if they attend to the text, they read the text, they do the activities, allows for the passing out of homework, and some independent learning can occur as well because everything is set forth for them. But again, a lot of what is done and how that's done, the pace is decided by the teacher. Just another great tangible example of what the authors are explaining in this section, worksheets. Again, perhaps some schools are moving away from worksheets, perhaps not. Certainly when I was learning to become a teacher, worksheets were just standard, that you developed your own worksheets, you used worksheets that had already been developed, and you created workbooks out of them, or maybe it was just one worksheet per lesson, but that they are a very well-heeled tool of the teacher and a very practice as usual approach to learning. So the worksheet is distributed at the beginning. It may have some image or text or activities embedded within it, and the student works through at a particular pace, sometimes in groups, and again allowed. The authors don't mince words here, but this low-level cognitive function, they're often seen as busy work. There's just recall of detail, meaning just simple comprehension. The students just focus on something tangible. Oftentimes it's very easy to see what students are doing because they're working each activity that is set out for them. The teacher can move around quickly, spend a couple of minutes perhaps on each student, viewing over their shoulders. There's that surveillance that goes on because you can see them working away at it. There is a completion point that the students then maybe can have some free time. So this idea that it's a motivational tool for teachers. So you begin the lesson, okay everyone, if you finish X, Y, and Z today on the worksheet, you can have free time doing something on the computer, talking with your friends, whatever the case is. So you think, well, it's a method of control. It's a method of ensuring that something gets done that looks busy. If there was a teacher to walk outside of the classroom they appeared in, all the students have their head down, pens or pencils busy on the worksheet. You as the teacher are then seen as being efficient, as being competent at what you're doing. And just another example, another great example, they talk about timetables as a technology of mass schooling. Ken Robinson refers to this in a way when he talks about that factory mentality of schooling, that the timetable allowed, much like the factory, a way to pass out particular activities for students. So it again is a method of control. It dictated en masse what was going on in a school. So students were funneled in particular ways into particular spaces in the school. It created order to the school day. It created order to break times, to physical activity times, eating times, etc. So structure became integral to the development of mass schooling. If we're going to educate our population en masse, we needed clear structure. It was working in the factory, so why not implement that in the school? So I like how they end this section, how they control teaching and learning in ways that make intrinsic interests and processes irrelevant. So this control ensures that anything that may differ, that may be different in terms of a particular interest that a child or even a teacher may have, particular process that may be different, that works outside of the mechanisms of control, it's irrelevant. It doesn't work within the structure, overall system. Couple of great sentences here that the authors just again work to reinforce their argument. They say all these technologies shape the lives of students and teachers. They both constrain teachers and students and enable particular practices and the development of particular capacities. So this, they're talking about, once again, the notion of power being productive. So these technologies act as a tool for power, but power not just being repressive, but power as productive. So the timetable and curriculum as technologies, for example, not just repress students. So you mustn't think about it just in those terms, but they create certain things, productive things, useful things. We may even say some good things. Certainly good in terms of being able to effectively work in the modern organization. So students who adhere well to those processes of timetabling, of learning curriculum at a particular pace, all of those things allow them to even say working in groups effectively, allow them then to ensure that they are effective in the workplace with teams, understanding that there's management there, that management decides certain things for people who are subordinate to that management system, that you need to follow in line with that. You need to ensure that you are safe in the workplace, all of those sorts of things. So it's good in that way. It's useful in that way. It's useful for the economy. But again, understanding that has a relationship there. So this last section here I wanted to talk about because they introduce another important concept, this notion of ensembles. So how different technologies that they refer to throughout this previous section, the power comes in not just individually, but how these are chained together or locked together, how they create an ensemble. So a school is not just about the timetable or just about the curriculum. It's how these things work together, how they create a chain or a web, if you like, how they lock together in a particular way, and how those pieces may move and shift and change over time. But that mass schooling, really since the 19th century, hasn't changed a great deal because the ensemble, the core ensemble of how these things work together hasn't changed. Again, there are some alternative schools that do things differently. I'm not referring to those schools. I'm referring to, on the whole, mass education in our country, again, whether that be public or private, but most students in our country transition schooling through or via this ensemble, okay? How these things are locked together in our education sphere. And as the authors rightly say, this makes practice as usual so difficult to change, because it makes it very difficult to imagine how we can do things differently, because all of this stuff is locking together, and changing one element seems to have this huge flow-on effect to everything else. If we think about doing, say, the timetable differently, so we say, okay, let's explode the timetable. Let's no longer have this factory mentality of schooling where young people aren't necessarily locked into a particular very lockstep timetable. Great, okay, but think about the flow-on effects of how that would radically change the whole way that the school is set up. So it would. How do you then decide on curriculum, for example? So if you have no timetable, what is the process of student learning in terms of different parts of the curriculum? In terms of the spaces, in terms of how we assess then. So the timetable locks together with all those other elements to make it very difficult to change it. And I've seen it occur in schools where I've worked, where very well-meaning teachers have looked to transform particular aspects of the school, but it's either very slow or incremental, or they reach lots of challenges, either the teachers, the administration, the students themselves, the parents, some of the administrative requirements of what the government decides about how kids should be learning, and all of those kinds of barriers that are created for transformative practices. So it doesn't mean that it's not possible. In fact, there are schools that are doing it and can do it. It does make it very difficult though. And it's not to feel defeated by it, it's just to understand it. Because if you are to affect change, it's something that you've got to work out that change occurs when largely many people get together and they can all be on the same page in terms of really radically shifting something. So yeah, it's just thinking about how change occurs, where you can affect change. There are particular schools where it may be much more difficult and others where it would be less difficult. So knowing where change can occur in important ways. I'm just going to stop that particular video. I think there's lots of ideas in that, and there may be a final coda video at the end here.